that had fallen on him. It was good that Henry came into her office because his name was already on the list, and he needed to know something important. In 3 days, he had to be at a meeting about which he knew nothing yet, but he could not miss it. Michelle said that the third year is organizing an event that will be held in the format of a fair fight. Many were waiting for Henry to appear at such an event, because everyone was interested in whether he was as good as they said. Thanks to this meeting, Michelle met a real genius who had already become famous at the academy and could help in the upcoming fight against mutants. She warned that she had no time for such trifles, but that students who performed well would be able to take something from the treasury. Michelle understood that this calculating student would not miss such an opportunity and was ready for his consent. But at that moment, another person wanted to get into her office, and he came not alone, but with a very important person. Edward, as promised, came in person to see his childhood friend who had applied for a transfer, and he and Julia could not miss such an event. Julia again addressed Michelle as her aunt, even though Michelle had asked her to address her formally many times in the presence of other people. The student council and disciplinary committee representatives came together to discuss the upcoming meeting. But Michelle didn't believe it was a coincidence. She was right, because Edward wanted to ask Henry directly if he was afraid to fight against Edward's council members, who would also be participating in the duel. Julia couldn't stand Edward's latest stupidity and reminded him that it was time for such a grown-up guy to stop talking nonsense. Julia was looking forward to the event more than anyone else and hoped that one of the students would teach this annoying freshman a lesson. The immortal spirit, realizing that Henry was ready to agree, immediately began to dissuade him, realizing that he would have to waste his energy on useless nonsense. There were many students who also wanted to achieve a high rank, but they found it hard to believe that a first-year student would enter the ring against a second-year student. Jimmy hated it most when people discussed his friends, so he asked the guys to shut up and close the door on that side behind him. He reassured his friend that only an idiot would challenge the members of the disciplinary committee, whose fighters occupied the top lines in the academy's rankings. Michelle reminded that all students come to the meeting voluntarily, and if Henry does not want to, no one will insist. But unexpectedly for everyone, the guy, who was already about to leave, answered with a smile that he had not yet announced his decision. Turning to them, he said that he could not disappoint Julia and Edward because they were looking forward to this spectacle, so he agreed. Seniors should not let their subordinates down, so Henry asked them to try not to lose to him at least in the first minutes of the competition. Finally, he loudly promised to try his best and expressed the hope that none of the committee members would lose face in front of their subordinates. The guy decided that before the demons attacked the academy, he would fight with masters of different ranks in order to quickly increase his level. Julia, although she wanted to see this student lose, declared that he was too arrogant and was playing with fire, pointing to one of the strongest members of the disciplinary committee. She declared that it was the big guy Bruce who would ensure the committee's victory and not be disgraced in front of the public. There was another man in the audience who was ready to fight Henry, and Edward only asked not to kill him, so as not to incur Michelle's wrath. The guy promised that, as deputy chairman, he would do everything in the best possible way and deal with him in an instant. That same day, his friends began to vie with each other to convince the guy that the final of the competition would not end well for him and that he should refuse before it was too late. Chloe heatedly explained to Henry who exactly would fight him and how their meeting might end. Jimmy agreed with her and reminded his friend that the guy standing behind Edward was very strong and probably had a high rank. Turning sharply to face her friend, the girl looked at him with eyes full of worry. Henry hoped that Sophia would believe in him and allow him to show everything he was capable of at the event. After a short pause, Sophia agreed with Henry and a slight smile appeared on the face of this sweet girl. While straightening his shirt, she said that since the gauntlet had been thrown down, it was necessary to give the opponents a worthy rebuff. At first, Henry thought that the girl would scold him, but she had no choice, because she could not change his decision. All she had to do was support Henry, telling him that he shouldn't give in, and that he had to show the true strength of a king that he had always possessed. The scene was like something out of an old movie, and Jimmy had popcorn ready to watch it until the end, waiting for the kiss. In the evening, the guy went to a familiar place on the riverbank, where he usually collected his thoughts before important events. Of course, he had the immortal spirit with him, who reminded him that the guy had been here too long and it was time to go home. But Henry wanted to find out that night how to regain the former power that he had in his past life before being reborn. After all, only with the help of new energy will he be able to release mana for a powerful attack, and without this, he can't even dream of victories. There was little time for study and even simple spells would take a week to successfully cast. But the immortal spirit did not take into account that the guy had recently experienced reincarnation, and his abilities developed differently. A person who has already mastered the highest level of skill should be able to quickly comprehend the basics of magic after reincarnation. Henry's past life memories contained the experience of learning many spells, and with the guidance of the spirit, they could be restored. But the spirit reminded once again that time is short, so we need to start right now. After listening to him, Henry put his palm forward, and with an effort of will, gathered in his hand the destructive energy capable of ensuring his victory. It took him a while to start activating the energy, and for a moment it seemed like he wouldn't have enough strength. But the very next second, a fire flared up in his hand, and even Henry himself was surprised at his dexterity. The immortal spirit was delighted to see that his disciple had activated his mana, and it was flowing freely out of his body. But the guy decided that training was enough for today, and with a slight movement of his hand, he extinguished the flame. The immortal spirit, who had just gotten ready to train seriously, was a little disappointed that Henry had finished so quickly. The guy explained that fire is not really his element, so he shouldn't use it for too long. But the wind is that very element, the rapid flow of which the guy could easily summon and use for his own purposes. And indeed, having activated this ability, the spirit saw that the guy began to rise above the ground, and it became clear that this ability was easier for him than for the others. Then the spirit saw the guy instantly take off and act as if he had watched too many Hollywood movies. He enjoyed controlling the wind, but it was important to remember why he had called upon this power, and not to get carried away. But this certainly did not threaten him, because after being in the air for only a few seconds, he fell to the ground. Swiftly flying towards him, the immortal spirit asked how long it took the boy in his past life to master this technique. It turned out to be no less than 5 months. And upon hearing this, the spirit realized that even after Henry's rebirth, he was still far from perfect. They have spent enough time and energy training today, so it would be better to go home and get some sleep. But suddenly the guy jumped up again and began to tame the element of fire, which was the most difficult for him. This time the flame lasted in his hand for a few seconds longer, although he still couldn't hold it for as long as he wanted. I wonder how much enthusiasm this young man has, because after so many failures he still continued to train. Even those disciples who had learned the craft from the immortal spirit during their lifetime could not compare to this guy in tenacity, and this was worthy of respect. But still, smiling, the immortal spirit reminded that at this rate he would waste all his strength and would have no mana left for future training. The first rays of the sun appeared in the sky, and it became clear that the guy had been training all night, and he still had a lot to do today. But his long training did not end there, and the guy spent 3 whole days in that place, mastering skills that usually took 6 months. At the end of the training, he fell exhausted onto the sandy shore, and the immortal spirit was seriously worried about his health. But still, Henry was glad that he had learned a lot in these 3 days, although an important meeting was coming soon and he had to go. Of course, the spirit knew that he had a capable student, but he did not expect such persistence from Henry, and Henry promised himself that if he was lucky enough to win the duel, he would invite Sophia to meet the dawn with him on this beach. Never in his life had he wanted to capture good moments so much. But today was the day when he didn't mind spending time on something important. He even imagined how, in good weather, he and Sophia would walk along the shore and admire the sunrise. But he realized in time that these were just dreams. After all, now he needs to show and practice everything he has learned, and this fight was an excellent opportunity. Moreover, with the immortal spirit, he was ready to defeat any opponent and had no doubt that he would perform well. After a short while, he found himself at the gathering place for the exchange of experiences among cultivators, where many spectators had already gathered. Not only was Michelle at this event, as she promised, but the master of the academy was also there. Edward decided to stand and watch the upcoming fight of his childhood friend, because for him, it was not just a spectacle, but part of the main mission. It was clear from Julia's look that she wanted to take revenge on the narcissistic student, who also ruined her relationship with Sophia. And Henry's first opponent today was a second-year guy who, although not particularly well-known, had a high level of strength. Now he was fighting with a guy from that clan who had recently surrounded Henry with his guys on the sports field on Charlie's orders. The second-year student easily defeated him, and it became clear that only a fighter with a lot of experience could fight him. With annoyance, John realized that he had lost this fight just as he had on the sports field, and had fallen for the same trick again. Immediately after this, Michelle loudly announced that the first-class trials were over, and it was time for the second- and third-class fighters. But in response, the guy showed a gesture that immediately, without words, explained his attitude to Michelle's words. He then turned to all the newcomers who wanted to fight him and told them to remember this lesson forever. Yes, this guy was not only confident in himself, but was also ready to conflict with any first-year student, although it was unlikely that any of them would dare to seriously enter into a fight with him. Jimmy was beside himself with rage, realizing that if his friend had been there, he would have taught this upstart a lesson and shown him his place. Watching the fight, Agatha was sure that even with his abilities, Henry would hardly be able to cope with even one fighter. Suddenly, Sophia realized that Agatha called Henry by his first name for the first time, although before she had always called him just an idiot. It seems that Agatha's attitude towards this guy changed a lot after she saw what he was capable of. At this time, Edward was already seriously worried that Henry would do the same as he did in childhood and run away without ever trying his hand. Julia also despaired, deciding that all this time Henry was just pretending to be a hero. But when it came to the real fight, he still did not appear. But one of the spectators suddenly shouted loudly that a strange silhouette was visible in the sky, and everyone looked up at once. Incredibly, high in the sky was the silhouette of that very newcomer that the students had been talking about lately. It was indeed Henry, who had long since mastered his new sacred artifact, and standing on his sword, was ready to descend to the audience. Never before had the friends seen Henry in such a light, and now there was no doubt that the boy had not spent these 3 days training in vain. Having made a dramatic landing in the center of the ring, Henry immediately heard enthusiastic shouts from the stands, who began calling him the king of the rookies. Julia didn't seem impressed by this appearance, although perhaps she was simply hiding her emotions to avoid unnecessary suspicion. Michelle, seeing the guy's ability to fly with the wind, was convinced that her suspicions about him were correct. Edward, like everyone else, was surprised by the speed with which the first year had reached such a level of combat power, since his rank was now no lower than 15th. The fighter standing opposite him was also strong and did not believe that some freshman could defeat him. Henry, looking his opponent straight in the eye, declared that he was the only freshman ready to challenge the arrogant seniors. It was clear from the fighter's look that a simple trick with flying on a sword was not enough to win a real fight, and he was going to prove it. Henry declared that he would win this fight with just 3 blows, after which his opponent would not be able to get up. It was unlikely that the senior student expected such a bold statement from the newcomer, and all his plans for Henry were visible in his gaze. He was ready to tear Henry apart. And although there was a big difference in strength between the seniors and juniors, today he was ready to make an exception. Julia, watching from the stands, realized that the senior student was seriously angry and began the fight with one of his strongest attacks. He used his signature turbulent water spell, and a huge wave, capable of knocking you off your feet, rushed straight at Henry. Any other freshman would probably have given up before the fight even started, knowing that he couldn't handle such pressure, but Henry wasn't one of them. He had proven magic against such attacks, and, putting out his hand, he immediately blocked the water flow. Feeling the energy of the water, he spread his arms, and the flow, as if on command, split in 2. Henry found himself right in the center of the stream, but it was clear that the water did not even wet his clothes. It looks like the fighter will now have to admit that the freshman was able to break his attack with his bare hands, which means that all the rumors about him are true. Michelle noticed that Henry was using an ancient technique that a simple student couldn't know. But how did he know about it? Julia was angry that Henry was initially recorded as an ordinary student, although he was a real genius in terms of abilities. Sophia suddenly saw that the water stream strike was not the only ability of her friend's opponent, and loudly warned Henry to be careful. Henry had been prepared for this for a long time, and when the next volley was fired at him, he had already prepared a counterattack. He had long since mastered the element of wind and could move through the air as quickly as if he had been studying it all his life. The water jet that was supposed to end the fight turned into ice due to Henry's speed and froze in the air. Henry found himself right behind his opponent, and the spectators already knew how it would all end. The fighter seemed ready to parry any blow, but he certainly didn't expect such speed of movement from the first-year student. Henry, as promised, was going to finish the fight with 3 punches, and it looked like it was time for the last one. He launched such a powerful attack that his opponent flew into the air, and it was unclear how far he would fly and whether he would remain in the stadium. Luckily, he fell into the stands, but the impact from such a height sent several people flying. He himself had difficulty coming to his senses and was definitely no longer capable of continuing the fight. It was hard to believe, but a newbie had surpassed a second-year student, although the difference in strength between first and second years is usually very large. Henry stood there and accepted the loud applause from the stands chanting his name. Sophia sighed with relief because her friend was no longer in danger, and he won this unequal battle. Jimmy was once again convinced that his friend was capable of defeating even the strongest second-year student, and wanted to learn the same techniques over time. Henry actually carried out the attack with only 3 moves, and Agatha had never seen anything like it in her life. Edward was still standing and watching the fight, and at first he couldn't figure out what this guy's secret was. But there was clearly something wrong with him, because his power was comparable to students of at least the 30th rank, which meant he could defeat even an academy graduate. Without turning to Michelle, Julia quietly said that she had seen everything herself and asked her to comment on what was happening. Michelle admitted that this guy's mana was stronger than even her own, and any techniques he performed would be more powerful than usual. This news upset Julia, because she believed that there should be no mana purer than hers in the world, and the guy managed to surpass everyone again. The spirit was pleased with his ward's victory, but reminded him that the power cultivated by chaos is a disorderly flow of energy that has yet to be tamed. Michelle announced that the next fight would be with a third-year student, since no other second-year students dared to challenge the winner. Julia, realizing that this was her chance, ordered Bruce to teach the guy a lesson and show everything he was capable of. Henry could have refused, because no one forced a first-year student to fight a third-year student if he didn't want to. But after everything that happened, the guy could hardly refuse the fight, especially since his opponent was already rushing towards him. Bruce, like Henry, could move through the air and instantly found himself near the ring. Plus, he had magic at his disposal that Henry had probably never encountered before. And that was a serious test. This formidable warrior was a member of the disciplinary committee and ranked 20th in the cultivator rankings. But Henry's grin showed that even if he had been in first place, it would not have changed the outcome of the fight. He stated that Bruce should call him Dad, because compared to him, his abilities are child's play. The joke drew laughter from the stands, which helped ease the tense situation a little. But this only made Bruce more excited, and he prepared to show the upstart the true power of his mana. But first, Henry needed to formally answer whether he accepted the challenge. Agatha immediately asked Sophia to persuade the guy to refuse, because a fight with a third-year student could be fatal for him. Sophia obeyed and loudly asked Henry not to do this, because the victory over the second-year student was already quite enough. The guy looked at the stands and saw that all his friends were happy about his victory in the first competition. But no one wanted to continue the fight. And although they were all right and he would not have lost face by refusing the duel, he had completely different plans from the very beginning. And looking straight at his opponent, around whom a powerful energy had already gathered, he suddenly loudly accepted the challenge. In fact, Henry wasn't here for the experience, because in the upcoming battle with the monsters, the enemies would be much stronger than this third-year student. Many spectators in the stands, realizing that the guy was really going to fight, covered their faces with their hands so as not to see what this strong man would do to him. Sophia had hoped until the very end that Henry would listen and refuse, and now she didn't even know what to think about her friend. Agatha again began to insist that the idiot remained an idiot, although just recently she thought that the guy had matured and become smarter. It seems that Edward's problem has solved itself, and now he doesn't even need to ask Ronald to engage in a fight with this freshman. Ronald, knowing Bruce's character, believed that the boy would either die or remain disabled for the rest of his life. However, Michelle knew that the outcome of the battle was not so obvious if Henry was the mysterious genius from the sports field. The girl, without wasting time, announced the start of the fight. And from the amount of energy around Bruce, it became clear who would strike first. Although he admitted that the first year was more skilled in combat than he thought, and in another situation they might even have become friends. However, Henry was not as friendly as Bruce, believing that he could be simpler and not speak so arrogantly. And then, unexpectedly for everyone, it was Henry who rushed into the attack first, instantly breaking away from the spot. A second later, he was already next to his opponent and, swinging, prepared to deliver the first blow. But judging by Bruce's smile, he was ready for this, and considered the move too naive for his victory. Suddenly, Henry felt as if some invisible chain was wrapped around his arm, because a whirlpool of Bruce's energy was already swirling around his body. He was unable to strike, as if an invisible force was directing his fist in a completely different direction, and not at his opponent. The guy ended up hitting next to the strong man, who just looked down as the stones flew apart after the hit. Henry realized that he had underestimated his opponent, jumped aside and prepared for a more serious fight. The guy again noted that Henry demonstrated excellent strength and speed, but against his level it was pointless. But if it was not possible to win with brute force, then magic was sure to help in this battle. And then he created a wind blade using the wind element, which flew at great speed straight towards Bruce and was sure to break through his defense. But, to the surprise of the audience, the third-year student remained in place and did not even try to dodge. No one saw how the magic had already worked around him, creating an invisible barrier that could not be broken through with simple techniques. Yes, it seems that this made Henry think seriously about his plan, because this way he would use up all his strength and not have time to land a single blow. And the wind blade, as expected, hit Bruce's energy barrier with all its force, without reaching his body. And then the wind couldn't even break through from below the barrier. Because from the ground itself, the magical barrier that kept the guy away continued to work. Standing like that, the third-year student at some point even wondered why he had come to this event, which from the very beginning seemed boring to him. And then everyone heard a bang, as if a rocket had hit the ground, and nothing could be seen in the entire stadium because of the dust that had risen. Bruce's punch was so powerful that a deep crack ran from the center of the arena to the stands, as if the stadium had been cut with a giant knife. The spectators were shocked to see such power with their own eyes, and Henry's friends regretted that they could not dissuade him from the fight. There was only one person at the event who secretly rejoiced at his friend's success, and anticipated Bruce's victory over this unfortunate student. For the first time in a long time, Henry realized that the strange power that so easily changed the trajectory of his wind blade could not belong to an ordinary person. The student began to applaud mockingly, saying that he admired his 15th level of strength, but his wind blade would not break through the barrier of the 30th level. Henry realized that his opponent was using a technique that made the wind mana move around his body in a special trajectory, and the blow was redirected in the other direction. Yes, it was the first-year student's correct guess, and no matter how many attempts Henry made, not a single one of his spells would reach the enemy's body. So this guy could repel any attacks with his eyes closed, and that's why the committee treated him with such respect. But at that moment, Julia thought about the fact that 2 attacks had already failed, but the freshman was still not going to give up. Michelle also noticed the boy playing with fire, but asked Julia to stop Bruce from inflicting fatal blows. Of course, the girl didn't plan to weaken her attack, because that would mean an unfair fight, and she couldn't stand it when newcomers were put in a more advantageous position. Suddenly, Bruce admitted that he agreed to the fight at Julia's request, and if Henry apologized to the girl, he himself would refuse the fight. But all the stands unanimously cheered for the newcomer Henry, wished him luck, and continued to loudly chant his name. After defeating one of the strongest members of the disciplinary committee, all the students will respect him so much that past grievances will leave his life forever. To tell the truth, Sophia couldn't help but be happy about her friend's steadfastness. But if her parents found out about it, they definitely wouldn't be happy. Bruce seemed to be hinting that Henry could also become a member of the disciplinary committee if he agreed to his terms and apologized to the president. But the boy was not interested in student fun. So crossing his arms, Henry was forced to refuse. Yes, no one had ever dared to refuse Bruce so brazenly, and he especially could not stand those who did not respect his committee. And so it could be considered that childishness was over, and the time had come not just to defend oneself, but also to attack oneself. And then Henry realized that by using the raging flames, Bruce was trying to combine fire and air and attack him with both elements at once. It was amazing, but a third-year student could use 2 spells at the same time, something only the highest master of the academy could do. Julia guessed that the guy had had this legendary skill of controlling 2 elements for a long time, and his next attack would be brutal. In fact, Michelle herself made an exception, and gave him a protective pearl that made him invulnerable for a time. If Henry is stubborn and continues to fight, then it seems he wants to commit suicide. Otherwise, this bravery cannot be explained. Edward was also well versed in this magic, because when wind and flame are released simultaneously, their power increases many times over. Bruce advised the guy to come to his senses one last time, loudly declaring that he definitely wouldn't get a third chance. And in his hands, he already held 2 elements, ready at any moment to merge into one, and deliver a crushing blow with a magical projectile. Both girls shouted with all their might towards the arena, trying to reason with their friend and dissuade him from fighting before it was too late. They begged him to surrender before Bruce turned into a killing machine, seeing how quickly his magic was developing. For a moment it even seemed that the third-year student had drowned in his own magic, because his elements filled the entire space of the arena. Only now did Sophia suddenly realize that she no longer felt her friend's energy, and even burst into tears from fear, realizing that he might not have been able to withstand such an onslaught of the elements. It was hard to believe, but he could have actually died after Bruce activated his ultimate ability at full power. Although Edward thought that someone who once dared to challenge him could hardly die so soon. Julia at one point pounced screaming at her aunt, who had the opportunity to stop it but did nothing. And then she loudly shouted to her subordinate that she only asked him to teach the student a lesson and not to kill him. But Michelle calmly replied that this guy was still alive, and she could still feel his powerful mana somewhere nearby. It was a bold statement, and Julia had no reason not to believe her aunt, who was superior to many in her abilities and knew what she was talking about. And then something happened that shocked even Michelle, who knew about Henry's abilities, but had no idea that they were so enormous. From the raging flames, in the very center of it, a black silhouette suddenly appeared, and it became clear that it was Henry, who had withstood the influence of two combined elements. Even Bruce had never seen anything like it, and was sure that no human could survive something like that. Only the immortal spirit began to guess that the Empress had combined the magical power of demons and the body of a human, creating a creature very similar to his ward. He knew that man, the product of heaven and earth, carried within himself such power that it was impossible to destroy both elements. The real secret of chaos was in the true law of the human race, and this force, which carried all the laws of the world, was carried within this guy. When the energy begins to perfectly harmonize with the power of chaos raging inside Henry, he will become truly invulnerable. And right now, someone appeared out of the fire in the arena, someone whom no one could consider a simple student. Bruce saw with his own eyes how the harmonious elements of fire and wind were dispersed by an unknown force that the freshman possessed. The big guy seemed to be proud of his ability to master two elements at once, but today he had to learn something new. After all, Henry had in his hands all 9 elements known to the universe, and he could control them as required by a particular duel. Julia knew that besides the Emperor's cousin, there was only one person in the world who could control any kind of mana. But could it really be Henry? Her guess was confirmed, and Michelle said that now they see before them the true body of chaos, which the Emperor has not even had time to master yet. However, she knew that such a technique had always belonged only to the ruling family, and Henry simply had nowhere to learn it. And those 2 elements with which Bruce had attacked Henry a couple of minutes ago, the guy now held in his hands, like loyal subjects. Even his appearance changed greatly after this phenomenal trick, and now no one had any doubts about who would win the fight. Now any of his spells were much stronger than usual, and the third-year student was definitely not an opponent who could resist. And then Bruce saw in horror how 2 fiery whirlwinds, mixed with the wind, were heading towards him to burn him to the ground. The pearl given to Michelle could hardly protect the guy from such pressure that even the Emperor himself could not resist. And just moments later, several fiery whirlwinds formed in the arena, surrounding the student from all sides. The protective pearl still had some energy left to protect Bruce from direct contact with the fire, but it gradually began to crack. It was at that moment that he saw above his head the same first-year student to whom he had recently bragged about his strength and promised mercy if he fulfilled his conditions. But it seemed that now it was time for the other man to make his demands. Although Henry was in no mood for talk and launched his one and only devastating attack. After that, he smashed the protective pearl in one fell swoop, and it shattered into small pieces before everyone's eyes. Finding himself behind his opponent, he placed his blade right at his back, making it clear who was the leader in this duel. Slowly turning around, Bruce saw before him a completely different man, one with whom he would hardly have dared to engage in battle 10 minutes ago. Looking at him sternly, Henry warned that if he did not surrender right now, he would die in the arena, and nothing would stop him from doing so. The guy was covered in cold sweat, but soon, with difficulty pronouncing words, he admitted his defeat. Now Michelle had no doubt that the unknown genius on the site next to the academy was indeed Henry. They remained in this position for some time, until Michelle admitted that Henry was the sole winner of today's event. The stands exploded with deafening screams, celebrating the victory of the new idol, who suddenly took on a different appearance in front of the fans. At the start of the fight, it was hard to believe that a first-year student would defeat a disciplinary committee member. But that's exactly what happened. But Sophia couldn't understand when her friend had managed to become so strong. Could it be that he had been hiding something from her all this time? For the first time in the Academy's existence, a first-year student made it into the top 20, and could soon even take first place in the rankings. Noticing Julia's silhouette in the stands, Bruce asked her for forgiveness for not living up to her expectations. But the girl immediately replied that she had underestimated the guy's abilities, so he shouldn't blame himself, but accept defeat. However, Edward had one more trump card, and now the time had come for someone who could compete with Henry on equal terms to enter the duel. However, Henry himself suddenly felt weak, realizing that the attack had taken a lot of his strength. His knees were shaking from exhaustion, and at some point he realized that he would not be able to stay on his feet for a second. And then, the guy fell onto the sand of the arena, realizing that controlling all the elements at once took more strength than expected. The spirit immediately calmed him down, saying that this was only due to being unaccustomed to it, and that he would soon reach the combat power of the 20th rank and cope with the load. At that moment, Michelle herself came out to the winner of the fight in the arena and said that the guy no longer had the strength to continue the competition. She believed that it was better to put an end to this and save her strength for the next event, rather than to act heroically and continue to fight with all her might. But even while sweating from fatigue, the guy didn't want to be deprived of the opportunity to continue, because he would never agree to give up. Michelle honestly said that the last challenger has a 50th rank of combat power, and even if Henry gives it his all, he won't win. He's already done a great job today, so there's no shame in refusing the next fight. But 3 days ago he promised that he would no longer run and hide from those who stood in his way, be it Buddha or the Creator himself. He was ready to trample anyone, because this was his only path, for which he was reborn. It was the first time Michelle saw such desperate courage on Henry's face, and of course, any girl always likes it. But she warned with a grin that there is always a price to pay for youth and frivolity. But then, she loudly announced to the audience that Henry had decided to continue, and now he was facing his final fight with the main contender for victory. At this time, his opponent was already ready to accept the challenge,